Good afternoon. I would like to touch on one of the very difficult and interesting topics. Conditionally, I called it "Is it possible to predict science?" One of the really difficult topics. What is science? Scientists have been talking about this for centuries, even millennia. There are very different points of view. The delusional definition, which is familiar to physics for biology, probably will not work here. Therefore, there are even positions such as the philosopher John Bernal, who believed that it was practically impossible to give an ordinary definition at all. Although, of course, there are a lot of such definitions. For example, one of the specialists in science, Karpov, at one time analyzed definitions that differ from each other. For example, what's on this screen here? The following is a similar definition. I just want to show you a few of these definitions to show how different they are from each other. For example, here or the next one. But there are also very qualitatively different approaches to interpreting the concept of science, not as a body of knowledge, but as a system of hypotheses. This is Karl Popper, and it seems to me that they also had the right to exist. Pay attention to this. The second question I want to ask is whether there was science on Earth and always has been. Of course not, but there are different points of view when it appeared. Some claim that this is an ancient society. These are Egypt, China, and India. There are already others who say that later, only in the 6th century BC, in ancient Greece. These are, of course, mathematics, geometry of Euclid and Pythagoras, astronomy of Ptolemy, logic of Aristotle, and many other areas that were. But if we take the latter with regard to interpretation, then this as a cultural phenomenon appeared in the sky century, and it is associated with the truth of the knowledge received. Although we know, of course, for a variety of scientists such as Lao Tzu and Confucius in China, and the Middle Ages Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, Biruni, and others. Will there always be science? It's not funny, it's unusual, but there are other points of view, and they have been around for a long time. For example, Schelling argued that science would gradually disappear and direct knowledge would appear. What he meant by this, we will not know for sure. At least his quote is listed here on this slide. Is it possible to predict the science itself? There are directly opposite points of view on this matter. But before considering these points of view, let's list several approaches to forecasting in general. This is based on a model of statistical methods and experimentation. What are some of the difficulties of modeling science? If we consider it as a model, firstly, it is very expensive and time-consuming to develop a model in general, and socio-economic statistics, or a socio-statistical model in particular. The problem is that serious models take several years to develop, even with modern computer technology. And the second problem is that we have developed this model and the object itself has already changed during this time. Something is changing. Science is changing very fast, faster than a model is being developed. And another problem, if we are talking about such an object as science, we do not have enough information to build models, types, sections, directions, and there are quite a lot of sciences, and they are difficult to intertwine. Difficulties in using statistics. Now I have told you about some small or large difficulties in modeling. But there are still difficulties in using statistical methods. Firstly, expert errors are numerical in the first place. Expert errors are rarely extinguished in the mass of data, and errors themselves are not characterized by normal or even logonormal distribution laws. The second point is that it is very difficult to choose the number of experts. Because few quantitative experts obviously work poorly, and a large number also work poorly, because experts are very different in levels and specifics of knowledge. Sciences and individual scientific regions and disciplines are united by too many interrelated factors. And the series that need to be considered for forecasting, if we use statistical methods, were often either short or very long, and both were bad. In this regard, the sample that we take for forecasting using statistical forecasting methods is rarely representative of the general population as a whole. Well, I would like to add more to the previous question. The problem is that very often information about science is not expressed in numbers. There are simplest forms of expert opinion, and the number is only one of, and the mathematics of other forms, such as interval assessments, analysis, and so on. It is developed, but few people can study it. Is it possible to predict the change of science with the help of experts? Well, let's start with the negative position of the well-known, deeply respected professor of Moscow State University Nalimov. He argued that in the current natural science activity, a forecast is possible and impossible. He says that this is due to the fact that science itself and its nature are quite revolutionary. This is the work of Karl Popper Kuhn, and in this regard, at the moment of the rise, concepts appear that act like programs that set the development, including experimental work, and predict, as they say, such an optimistic, romantic period of scientific development, but a completely different situation negatively affects it. It is complicated. Please, just when we are talking about negative situations, when old concepts are exhausted, they have a retarding effect, but even in moments of crisis, is it possible to talk about a forecast? In my opinion, the future here is not exhausted from the past, says Professor Nalimov. And there are a lot of problems here. He believes that this is a carnival of new ideas, guesses, epiphany, but not forecasts in his understanding of the concept of forecasting. From here, he will conclude that the meaninglessness of forecasts is based on expert assessments. He poses quite correct questions here. Such a task that will tell us in the future who will be preferred by the majority of expert speakers who have established a paradigm, or a minority who are looking for new ones. How to distinguish the sprouts of the new from the weeds that always accompany the development of science. These people asked quite correct questions, he did not answer them. And I already know the answer to some of these questions, so I am skeptical about this. Yes, says Professor Nalimov, there are for example, successful forecasts. Of course, there are, but why do they differ from the above non-scientific ones? So there is science in the argument, if it is told by more scientific people in the sense that representatives of the natural sciences understand, then why not all scientists have recognized this? And then why don't they use it in their research in the future? Let's look at some counterarguments. This is a very important negative position. Let's try to refute them at least partially. There are key concepts used by Professor Nalimov, and not only him. This is the concept of forecasts and the concept of scientific argumentation. At least, but from which the base is, and if we understand these key concepts equally, this is one fact. If we understand them differently, then this argument is very often inappropriate. In foreign literature, the concept of forecasts is in the works of Tail, a well-known specialist, but some reasoning is considered regarding unknown, as a rule, future events. In Russia, in the Soviet Union, the interpretation of the concept of forecast was somewhat different. This is a scientifically based judgment about the possible states of an object in the future and/or in alternative ways and timing of their achievement. I would like to draw your attention to the word scientifically based and the fact that alternative, that is various diverse scenarios. My definition of an expert forecast is as a result of the activities of all subjects of expert forecasting, and there are at least of them. which are presented in the form of documents and contained in the jury of an expert or experts on the dynamics of a parameter. Indicators analyzing an object or an alternative option for their possible development in the future. The first is objectively scientific, perhaps they are based on well-defined assumptions or hypotheses. Third, probabilistic in nature, it is very important. The fourth is adjusted within the forecast period as the latest information becomes available. Correcting the task statement is an inherently difficult topic, and it is still far from being finalized. The fifth block characterizes the definition of expert forecasting. It must be verified after the end of the forecast period. The sixth form should always be structured clear. Clear and not allowing for unexpected interpretations and fabrications, strictly corresponds to the task, accepted assumptions and hypotheses, evidence-based and reproducible, alternative. Let's return to the texts of Professor Nalimov. Here's the problem is that any judgment about the future is neither false nor true. This was further proved by Aristotle in the 4th century B. It follows that, for example, classical logic cannot be used to analyze such a period of predictive tasks. Now, in the 20th century, it was possible to find another kind of non-classical logic. This is short, if we speak, these are modally battling logics. It has a long title, which I said in the first part, and therefore there are problems that need to be taken into account, including when discussing. Another problem is that it is probabilistic in nature, and it is precisely these properties that we will consider our criticism of Professor Nalimov. There are different interpretations not only of the concept of probability, but also of axiomatics. And it is necessary to take as a basis not the interpretation of the concept of probability, which is accepted by the Soviet school in Russia. Academician Kolmogorov's axiomatics is a frequency one that works very well in a theoretical and applied sense, but mainly for technology, but for social sciences, where there is a lot of subjective factor. It is necessary to consider the concept of personal probability. Subjective is the method of Ramsey axiomatics, which was developed much earlier in The concept of forecast is interdisciplinary, so it is understood in different ways by different disciplines, for example, in mechanics and politics. Moreover, the content of both this concept and the concept of scientific argumentation is also changing, and this, one must understand, is very healthy. On this occasion, so to speak, there was the work of academician Stepin. He drew attention to the work of the famous the-century natural tester Buffon, and at one time, when he did earlier scientific work, he expressed extreme perplexity about the unscientific way of describing and classifying phenomena in each scientific foundation. But for example, the fact is that in the early centuries, and not only in the early ages, the knowledge of the world was then interpreted as deciphering the meaning embedded in things. That's what scientific means, and events were an act of divine creation. The latter were considered as duly split things and events, their natural properties, perceived simultaneously as signs of divine thought and as natural. This work of Stepin was very seriously considered. Thus, it is possible that we proceed from different interpretations of the concept of what is scientific argumentation. Answering Nalimov's question, why did other scientists not learn scientific forecasting methods and did not predict other very serious, even catastrophic manifestations of our culture? You can do this, and here I will quote from my book. Because there are very often heuristic and unique phenomena. They are focused on specific predictive tasks and are poorly amenable to algorithmization. Therefore, each time you need to select a specific method. There are, say, more than creative methods in the world. Unfortunately, there are still no methods in the real world that would allow you to specify exactly which of these tools to take in which case, hence the problem. Now I would like to touch on some of the reasons for the difficulty in predicting science itself. Firstly, the incorrect formulation of the forecast of the problem. Almost always. What is incorrect is a separate topic. It is very difficult to single out the object of forecasts. When forecasting science, it is always blurred. There are practically no experts. This is the third point. The encyclopedic character that existed in the Middle Ages. Here is a simple example. You won't find a mathematician who knows all the math. It's the same in physics. Similarly, each of these super professionals knows deeply a separate piece, section, direction at best. Fourth, it is necessary to know both current and past difficulties in the development of science. We must learn from our mistakes and understand the reasons for these difficulties. Now I would also like to touch a little on the reasons for the difficulty of developing science itself. Well, first of all, it has become very relevant now. A primitive assessment of the activities of scientists is not only at the present time. Consider Bernal's work in evaluating the activities of scientists by the number of publications that are currently being watched still does great harm. Scientists try to print as many works as possible, which clogs the scientific journal with mediocre, immature publications. The same is true of modern scientists. They love the overproduction of unfinished texts, publish them only to be counted. Another difficulty in the development of science is probably the information explosion. In accordance with the curve of the evolution of human knowledge, the influx of information on the planet is increasing much faster than the population. Here are the specific figures: how quickly the flow of information changes, how it doubles, for what period of years, then every month. This has already been discovered. Now to the reason for the difficulties in forecasting. Returning to this option, it is necessary to consider the development of science taking into account the needs of mankind in the field of economics, industry, and military affairs. The need to take into account the emergence of new ways of organizing science. Well, universities arose in the Middle Ages, then institutes, laboratories. And what will happen next in terms of organization is still unclear. And once again, the difficulty of forecasting. It is necessary to consider and take into account the stage of development of science. Well, here's a concrete example. The revival of science is, say, this century PE. The global scientific revolution is already the century. The transition from natural science to a disciplinarily organized science is the century. The acceleration of the requirements, among the main ones, of the integration of various sciences and scientific directions, the formation of a knowledge-intensive sectors of the economy. The century is already a century of technology, including information technology, and with a change in its interpretation. Since Henger has proposed changing the concept of technology, expanding the concept of technology. In The American Philosopher, Vick considered a new concept of technology. There are discussions going on around this now. The next reason is the difficulty of forecasting science, the difficulty in taking into account the development of methods of technology for obtaining new knowledge, as well as the imperfection of the use of predictive methods and models. Another difficulty is the transition from a subject to a problem orientation in order to create new branches of science. The eighth difficulty is accounting and the relationship between science and society. It is very difficult. Given that there are a number of parameters to take into account, they are not numerical. Well, the funniest thing is the lack of a forecast of the forecast itself, that is the methods of their science. How will you have what methods will appear, what new technologies will appear, what will appear next in order for the tools of technology to make it possible to predict, including the forecast? The 10th is the difficulty in taking into account the development of our education system. It is changing before our eyes. Thanks for attention.